What's up, everybody? Welcome in to another edition of SSPN Live. Dare I say, Ethan, the most anticipated position preview that we've done so far because it includes, of course, Victor Wembanyama.
Yes, the franchise. Um,
Ooh,
Absolutely the most important and easiest to talk about player on the San Antonio Spurs, Jude.
couldn't have said it better myself, Ethan. Now, it's funny that we start off with that. Obviously, that's who we're going to be talking about first in today's position breakdown, going over the San Antonio Spurs centers, Victor Wembanyama, Zach Collins, as well as Charles Bassey at the end there. But the thing that I've been thinking about this whole time, like when we've been doing all these position previews, right? So we've got all these different guys, and maybe there's a guy like Devin Vassell that we think is, can be an all-star one day, can be that all-star caliber player. Even, you and I may have some hope for Jeremy Sohan there.
Mm-hmm.
We'll have to see what happens with that and his role on the team and the makeup of everything. But with those guys, there's some things like right up front that you can kind of you can list strengths and weaknesses for those guys. When you go to the weaknesses portion, like for Jeremy Sohan, for example, like there was a I don't mean this in a negative way, but a list there of at least 5 bullet points that can come to your head, like right off the top.
For sure.
Maybe a little bit less for Devin Vassell, but still with those guys, there's things you can point out.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to Victor Wembanyama, I didn't really decide today, or decide until today, what I could list. Because really, when I think of it off the top of my head, I'm like, okay, what are we? What am I
Yeah.
supposed to do here? This guy, you could already argue, is a top 15 player in the league. We know he's the future of the NBA. I mean, we've talked about this for 2 years at this point. Ever since the lottery in 2023, we've known like what the potential of this could be if we won that lottery, which we did end up doing. So I don't just want to sit here and repeat, oh, he's 7'4". He can put the ball on the floor. He can shoot. He can score at all 3 levels. He led the league in blocks last year. A lot of people thought he probably should have been defensive player of the year. The Olympics may have shown that case to be even more true, depending on how you look at it. But I did come up with a few things in general. But what are your thoughts on kind of evaluating Victor just with the enigma that he is?
Yeah, in terms of just like his game, I think you summed it up perfectly. There's really no weaknesses offensively. He can score at all 3 levels. Defensively, probably the most versatile defensive player we've ever seen, period, in the NBA. And he definitely has the potential to be the greatest defender of all time when it's all said and done. And last year, statistically, had a phenomenal season, the clear front runner for Rookie of the Year. Obviously, early it was between him and Chet, but he ran away with it the second half of the season. In terms of things that he can improve on, potential weaknesses, it was kind of difficult to find because he does everything so well. But I came up with 2 that are kind of general, or actually, we can even make this 3. The first one is just impacting winning.
Okay.
Because obviously we had a really bad record last year. That wasn't his fault. We saw the difference between when he was on the court versus not on the court. But I think with him being so great already, the media is immediately going to bring that into question. Like, we're losing games, it's going to be on his shoulders. You're right. Whether that's right or wrong, that's how they're going to paint the picture. So that's one. The second part of that is not settling for outside shots. I know he's capable as a 3-point shooter. He shot 32% last year. He hit a lot of clutch jumpers late in games, but I think there were also a handful of games where, he kind of got lost along the perimeter. Not completely his fault. He played a lot of the year without a true point guard, which he has one this year in Chris Paul. So hopefully that some of that stuff will be remedied. But you wanted that guy that's 7'4" and as dominant as he is to get closer to the rim, especially as games come down to the final buzzer. And I think part of that also has to do with stamina. So I'm going to say hopefully he's been working on his stamina and able to play 30 plus minutes a game and into overtime games, because we did see that kind of him hit a roadblock at the mid-season point and sometimes kind of take a toll on him late in games.
We had to re-implement a minutes restriction.
We did. And the last point I'll make for Victor Wembanyama is something that LaMarcus Aldridge actually brought up, former Spur, on the All the Smoke podcast. And that's, he's so good. He has so many moves in his arsenal that it feels like sometimes he doesn't know which one to pick in any given situation. So he's like, I would just simplify it For LaMarcus, it was the left shoulder post hook and the left shoulder fadeaway, right? That
Right.
was his go-to move. And any counter or additional move he had to make from that was just up to whatever the defense gave or showed him, right? So Victor, it was like there's so many colors on his canvas, I guess.
Yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah.
he doesn't know which one to pick. So if he could just make it a little more simple, simplify his offensive game, especially in the first, second, and third quarter, I think that would go a long way for his stamina and for his efficiency.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you just said. The stamina point I think is a good one. And I think some of that is also just adjusting to the pace of the NBA, learning the differences and the intricacies of the
Mhm.
game. So I think, you could argue that that's naturally going to get better,
For sure.
especially with another NBA strength and conditioning camp. Obviously, he did have the Olympics this summer. So, you do want to take that into account. But I think especially with how that ended, I think even before that, this season, he was going to be coming in with, an even more determined mentality. But with the way that that ended, I know that's only going to, add smoke or excuse me, add fuel to that fire. That was, we've seen it in him, since the first interviews before he even,
Mhm.
was, before the NBA lottery in 2023. There's always been something special about him. That's why, he was the most hyped prospect since LeBron. And it's not just on the floor, it's also off the floor. But like you said, talking about stamina, that's definitely something to watch. I almost even, like when I mentioned earlier and talked about how we re-implemented that minutes restriction, that was
Mhm.
something that had even just slipped my mind, after this whole offseason that, we forget about. I have a
Mhm.
lot of confidence in that. Last year before the season started, with all the injury potential and stuff like that, we talked extensively about his training regimen, his hour and a half warm up, and how his main trainer was hired by the Spurs.
Right.
So I definitely have a lot of confidence in that. Obviously we're Spurs fans, obviously we're biased, but again, I've said this in more recent episodes, it's hard to put a cap on anything for this guy. I mean, and that's an understatement, it feels like. um and then what was the first thing you said again?
There was impacting winning and then
Yes.
finding a simple. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So for the impacting winning part, I completely agree there too. At the end of the day, he wants to get more wins on the table. The Spurs do. Adding Harrison Barnes and Chris Paul is going to help out a lot with that, in our opinions. But that is something that, you want to just see that progression. You want to see more wins added. And I think that is something that's very fair. I came up with three different things. I actually was able to find some things like on the floor. Granted, it's very nitpicky. It's like almost like he's already good at a lot of these things, but it's just like, how can he get a little bit better and be even more effective? And I think that kind of ties into your third point. But I'll read off my points here. We see a couple of y'all in the chat. Wemby's Castle always here. John G as well. We appreciate you guys. But here's what I wrote down. So strength was the first thing I wrote down. And it's
Mhm.
not to say that I don't have confidence that that's going to happen. Kind of, we just laid out his trainer, NBA strength and conditioning program, all that stuff. I do think that that's going to be the case. But here's the other thing. This is a 20-year-old Victor Wembanyama. Like, he's still growing into his body. As insane as that is to think about, like, think about him when he's 25, dude. Like,
Mhm.
you know what I mean? Like, that's so a lot of this is just his age and time. You know what I'm saying? Whenever it comes to strength. But the reason that I think that that could benefit him is twofold. So first, interior defense. I know that sounds weird with with him leading the league in blocks and basically against like 90% of the league. Victor's interior defense, there's nothing to criticize there. And that's why I kind of wrote down a little caveat here in my notes, but this is only really the improvement that I'm referencing here is only really against like MVP type bigs, like a Joel Embiid, who gave him 70 last year, or a Nikola Jokic. But while I'm saying that, there's still moments like the Bucks game last year in the comeback win where he stuffs Giannis at the rim. So when I say that, that is more like a very specific tier of, former MVP bigs,
Mhm.
that just have like 50 pounds on him at this point. You know what I mean?
For sure.
Just to hold his own there. So, like Joel can't do what he did last year. And you could argue, I know the Olympic rules are different, but you could argue you saw some improvement from that in the summer when he had to match up with Joel Embiid again in the Olympic final. Granted, very different set of circumstances, but still, it wasn't like Joel could just go in and do what he did like we saw in the Sixers game last year, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
But yeah, I said this only really improves his play against MVP bigs. He was already fantastic overall. And then the other thing that I think strength helps with is his post control. Whether that be backing people down, putting his back into guys, but also I think that would just help with his post bag in general. And that
Mhm.
was the second thing. And this ties into the LaMarcus point that you mentioned. It really, the thing I wrote down is just post moves, just adding more to that bag because he has that skill set with his size, length, and skill. I mean, we know Tim Duncan's still around the facility. He's getting coached by Greg Popovich. David's still around. We've seen them interact for all throughout the years. And it's not
Mhm.
just those guys that are going to be teaching him post moves, but Timmy's going to be in the practice facility giving him pointers. And just with, his shooting ability, whether that be the post fadeaway, we saw Wemby's castle mentioned earlier. Imagine Wemby doing a sky hook. Just putting him in the post and him just adding to that skill set a little bit this season to where it looks more fluid and smooth in the specific moves that he likes. Now again, that ties into the LaMarcus point. He's got to figure out which one of those that he does like, because we don't just want to be throwing everything out there when maybe he could find two that he can really fine tune and just be more effective at in that kind of LaMarcus esque role, if you will. So that's another thing I wrote down. And then the last thing I wrote down for Victor, well, actually two more things, but ball handling. And I know we saw so much good ball handling from Wemby, but there were some times where he'd lose his dribble, trying to speed up in transition or something like that. You know what I mean? Or maybe he tried to
Mhm.
take people off the dribble and get pickpocketed. We saw at the beginning of the season, the fluidity wasn't as good as it was at the end of the season, but that's also a testament to his improvement. But the things I wrote down, just a little more control with his dribble / coordination. I think we already saw that growth. I think we'll continue to see that. But imagine his step backs getting even more smooth. Like how
Mhm.
it's already deadly, but if he could get more control with that, it's going to be literally insane and like tough for anybody to defend.
Mm.
The other thing I was thinking about, like if he can get some crossovers going, Ethan, I know that's a lot to ask, but remember, we remember at All Star Weekend, he's working with Jamal Murray, or excuse me, not Jamal Murray, Jamal Crawford.
Mhm.
um, and I believe that they did end up like meeting. I may just be making that up in my head over the summer, but I thought I saw something like that. They did end up working out together.
They did.
Okay, I'm glad my memory didn't fail me there. So yeah, I mean, I don't think that's as out of the question as much as, I'm not expecting an insane jump, but when you're working with Jamal Crawford, Chris Paul added to the roster. That was something I totally, I'm just so fixated on Chris Paul helping the guards that we have because, we're when you think about improvement, you think more about our guards, not Victor Wembanyama, the franchise. But still, think about the things that CP3 can teach Victor whenever it comes to his pass
Mhm.
vision as well as his ball handling. I mean, that is just and pass IQ as well is another thing that I wrote down. But with those crossovers, man, if he can, dribble around somebody, we could see more pull up mid range jumpers, things like that. And obviously, I mentioned the step backs earlier. Again, this is super nitpicky because what he's doing at his size is already so crazy. Um, but at the same time, if he can improve a little bit there, get a little bit more controlled, add some more moves to his bag, that just makes him even more scary
Mm.
as an offensive player. And then the last thing is just shooting. We believe in his jump shot. That's not what I'm saying here. This kind of goes back to the Mamu Jeremy Sohan thing that we talked about last week. If you put their jumpers side by side, which one looks better, right? And he still shot at 32% overall from the field from three last season. And specifically, when I say shooting, I mean 3-point shooting. Want to clarify that because his mid range is already pretty much down. And the main thing, whenever it comes to his 3-point shooting, Ethan, is just the catch and shoot percentage because we saw the differences between that last year. He shot a higher percentage of off the dribble threes versus his catch and shoot threes,
Mhm.
in the pick and pops with Devin or CP3, or whoever it may be. You want him to just be able to, or even maybe sometimes if he gets left open. I don't think that's going to happen that often, but if we can increase that percentage a little bit on the catch and shoot specifically, that's one thing that again, I mean, will just make him more and more deadly. So I
Mm.
think you can kind of see there. A lot of that is nitpicky, but I did find some things that, I think could be improved a little bit and just make him even more dangerous.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, let's get to the comments here because I see there's a lot of stuff going on. Jedi Trick says trade for Jimmy Butler. I don't know if you saw that.
I don't think it's happening.
I don't think it's happening either. I think that is just a September, August NBA dead season rumor that picked up some traction that we'll now continue to see with Victor, kind of like the Laurie Markkinen thing we saw this summer.
Mhm.
And here is what Trenchant T or dot T 099 says, it might sound crazy, but we're going to go as far as Zach Collins takes us. That's probably our weakest position now. Backup center. He says back center, but I'm sure he means backup center. Um, and another thing he says about that is Collins has to be a big part of the season. I have faith everyone else will get better, plus with CP3. But Wemby's Castle brings up another point here, and he says, don't forget Charles Bassey, who is 100 times better than Zach Collins. I don't know if I would say 100 times better, but I'm glad. The reason I bring this up is because we're going to get into Zach and Charles individually. But I had this question written down, and since the chat's already talking about it, I'll dish it to you here. So, what are your thoughts on the backup center position? And do you think there's going to be a battle between Zach and Charles going into training camp and preseason?
Yes, I do believe that there will be a battle, but for the backup center position, and it all depends on Zach Collins. I think it is his position to lose when he's at his best. What we saw from him when we traded Jakob Poeltl 2 seasons ago was peak Zach Collins. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I believe he averaged about 17 points a game, close to like 7 or 8 rebounds and like 4 or 5 assists. Like he has a lot of skill to his game, and I think really what his major downfall was losing confidence in his jump shot. When he can
Yeah.
space the floor and be a 3-point shooter and knock it down at a mid 30s to upper 30 percentage, he's deadly because he's also a great passer. He can kind of take you off the dribble, and he's got a lot of post skill. Like he's got a lot of up and unders. He's a Gonzaga big, so he has that Domantas Sabonis ability. Trouble with him is he's just kind of thinner. He's not a banger down low. He's not a big rebound guy. And everything that he does poorly in terms of physicality, Charles Bassey does very, very well. So if he's not hitting shots, Jude, if we get into
Right.
training camp and he's missing, he's bricking threes like he was last year, or we get into preseason and the first month and a half of the season and he's shooting 20% from three, he can't buy a shot. I think you absolutely have to go to Charles Bassey. But it's really up to his to lose because if he's hitting, we've seen the rest of his game really blossom.
Yeah, I hate to go back to this because now at this point it's 2 seasons ago, but at the end of the 2022 season, the 17-8-4, what we saw from Zach Collins, like that's Zach Collins at his best and being an effective player.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, since then, in the past 2 seasons since then, we really haven't seen much consistency from him.
Hmm.
There's just no other way that I can put it. I'll write down what I had for Zach here. I didn't have too much because we've talked about Zach so much,
Yeah.
and I think, I even looking at the chat, people kind of know, that Zach Collins, being better or being worse, could be a key for us this season, or, is at least, the weakest point in the rotation.
Yes.
But here's what I wrote down. Interior defense is the main focus. You could say perimeter defense as well. I know that's basically all of defense. And maybe he's just never going to be that guy. But if he can at least just stand stout and put his hands in the air and not just get completely bullied, I feel like at the beginning of last season, if I'm remembering correctly, we saw a little bit of an improvement there. And then it
Yes.
kind of just turned back to exactly what it was the year prior. And then shooting, like you said. I really think whenever it comes to this, I asked you this question about Zach and Charles and there being a preseason battle. I think it all comes down to Zach consistently hitting shots, because if Zach's getting bullied on the interior and he's shooting sub 30% threes, at that point, me personally, like I'm kind of rooting for Charles to go in, and it's just tough because Zach's 26 now, maybe 27. Let me go confirm that. He's getting closer to 30. And so 26, but when the season starts in November, he will be 27, and when we signed this contract, if you would have told us that Zach is kind of where he's at right now, I think if we're being honest, we'd be a little bit disappointed, you
For
know.
sure.
And so, with all of the injuries that's happening every year, it's just hard for me to continue to have this belief in Zach Collins' potential. At the beginning of this contract 3 years ago, when he's 24, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Then, it was a little bit different to be more optimistic. But from what we've seen so far, because we've seen some flashes in his career and he's still on the roster, and I believe in the Spurs development staff, like maybe I hold like a 5% chance of hope he can return to kind of what we saw at the end of 2022.
Mhm.
Honestly, I'm not that confident in it. Um, but yeah, I mean, that's kind of my thoughts on Zach. Here's the last two things I had written down. Keeping that dog mentality throughout the game. Because say what you want about Zach Collins, he doesn't take anybody's crap, and he stands up for his teammates. And as
Yes.
much as, he may be getting bullied on the interior sometimes playing defense, he doesn't allow himself to literally get bullied on the floor. And that's one of the reasons that we're excited about him when he got here. And then the last thing is just staying healthy.
Yeah. I feel like I should say, in fairness to Zach Collins, if he were to watch this video and be completely offended, we have to remember he was playing next to Wemby for a good couple of months last year, and then was moved to the bench. And we kind of gives Keldon a little bit of a pass because his role was never truly defined last year at times, as well as Trey Jones. The same can be said for Zach Collins. And how many times did he play with a consistent unit, even second
Yeah.
unit, when he was finally moved to the bench? Like, it was very rare. So I want to give him the benefit of the doubt, which is why I think he will be the backup center to start the year, for sure. And we will have him there next to Stefan, with Keldon, with Trey, and whoever else is off the bench unit, maybe Mamu, and just see how that chemistry feels, because he is a connective piece offensively. I think he's a good voice for the team on the
He's a
court
good
as well.
passer.
Great passer. And if he can just knock down those shots, I think we can maybe forgive some of the poor physicality, especially on the defensive side. But at the same time, Charles Bassey's sitting there tapping on his shoulder. And if he can stay healthy, he is a phenomenal screener. He's a great lob catcher, and he doesn't get in anybody's way. And we don't expect him to hit shots. That's not going to be a part of the
Yeah.
game plan. For Zach, it's a part of the game plan. So if he's not executing, he can't be on the court.
I think you kind of summed it up perfectly there at the end, Ethan. We appreciate all you guys being in the chat today. We're excited for this season to come. First NBA basketball games will be 2 weeks from now, believe it
Mm.
or not. October 4th. That's not when the Spurs play. The first Spurs game is October 7th, which is a Monday. We'll update you guys on our preseason live schedule and all of that stuff. And just because we're talking about kind of the schedule and everything right here, next week, just to give you guys a heads up, we will be doing our full out season predictions, record predictions, all that type of stuff. But getting back to Zach and Charles, honestly, with Zach, I don't really think there's anything
I
else
don't
to
have
be
anything
said.
else.
I hope, I think the context that you brought up there, I think is key. And, when you talk about, if we want to just look at this in a totally optimistic light, I'm not saying that this is going to happen. If we're just looking at this from perfect worldview, right, scenario,
Mhm.
his, let's say he gets healthy, gets better on defense. I'm asking a lot. Again, this is like hypothetical fantasy land. But playing next to Stephon Castle, Trey Jones, Keldon Johnson, Mamu, mainly Castle is kind of the big point I'm thinking about there. Could potentially, mitigate the defensive woes. Honestly, the more I'm talking about that, I don't really think that's going to happen. But let's just get to Charles Bassey.
Yeah,
So here's the other things that I have written down for him. Ironically, the first thing I have for him is also health, because we haven't seen him play a healthy season either. So
for
that's kind of
sure.
something they share in common. Um, this is kind of critiques here. So I'm going to talk about some of the benefits of Charles, like in comparison to Zach. And you touched on him a little bit, but he's just a much more physical player. He's a bigger body. He's your traditional run, jump, and dunk center. We've seen him, show more in the G League, but on the Spurs, that's what he's going to be. I forget the exact stat. I know I brought it up a while back, but in the 2022 seasons in the Teal Fiestas, he broke some NBA record of like under 20 minutes, like having a double-double. I forget exactly the details, but
Yeah.
we brought that up. The SSPN OGs will know what I'm talking about, and the Spurs fans will too. So that's something that he does, like kind of Charles's strengths are what Zach's weaknesses are that are kind of hurting us, other than shooting right now. So I definitely see the appeal. To answer the question earlier from my side, I think this is a real position battle. And the other thing we forget, there were times last year where Zach struggled and Pop straight up benched him for Charles.
Yeah.
So I think that's a realistic possibility. Um, and to just talk a little bit more about Charles, the only thing that I could think of to maybe critique a little bit, again, this is not, we're not going to be asking him to do that much defensively other than just guard the paint. But I wrote down defensive IQ just because he's a young player, 23 years old. Another thing, offensive IQ. The other thing I wrote down in parentheses here is this is a totally experience based critique, and if there's any, players now with Harrison Barnes and Chris Paul, I know they're not centers, but still, and coaching staff to improve IQ, I think it would be this one. And then the last thing I wrote down for Charles, and I don't think we're going to ask him to do this a lot, but maybe teams, if he does end up being the backup center, maybe teams will scheme this on us, is just hitting some open middies if they leave him open. Again, that's a low rate circumstance, but that's really what I had written down on Charles.
Yeah, Charles Bassey, I think the best way to describe his strengths is how you did. His strengths are Zach's weaknesses. Physical, really good rebounder, a shot blocker, but that doesn't necessarily mean, like you said, he's a great defender. I think there are a lot of opportunities for him to be a better connective piece on defense as well as offense. Great screener, great roller. He's not going to take shots from anybody. He's not going to take ill-advised shots. I think he shoots 70% from the field. And the more I think he might, if he does get meaningful time, he could benefit more than a lot of us or a lot of the other players from Chris Paul. Who do I think of when I think of a 6'10", 6'11" athletic center who can't hit a free throw and is a great dunker and shot blocker that benefited from Chris Paul? DeAndre Jordan.
Yeah.
Second round pick, first couple years at the Clippers, he was a 5.5 rebound guy. What did Charles Bassey average for us last year? 3 and 4. Granted, he was injured, but I see a lot of similarities in at least how they approach the game. So, and he's only 23 years old. I think we often think that he's really old because of the amount of injuries that he has sustained. But if he can stay healthy, like you said, I think that's the biggest thing for him. If he can stay healthy and actually get meaningful time, I would just look for him to be exactly that, an athletic pick and roll guy who makes the right play and doesn't get in anybody's way.
Yeah. And, you could think about that in that scenario. If we're looking really optimistic, we talked about the Zach Collins side. If we look at the Charles Bassey side, that could maybe open up looks for a Keldon Johnson, a Stephon Castle, even a Trey Jones and Mamu, because all those guys have the ability to put the ball on the floor. For sure. We're not trying to sit here and say that the Spurs bench unit is going to be the best in the league or anything. But, I think when we're talking about it, if I'm just being completely honest right here, I like the fit of that backup lineup a little bit more with Charles.
I do too. I meant to say that especially with Mamu as his front court pairing. Mamu, who was our backup for last year? It was Chetty Osman, right?
Yes, basically.
I like Chetty a lot. I think Mamu and Bassey is a better complementary pairing than Chetty and Zach was last year.
Yeah. I completely agree. And I believe that Charles and Mamu also kind of came in at the same time on those two-way deals. Was Mamu's first year a two-way? I can't remember.
Yes. That's a great question.
Even if it wasn't, they came in around the same time. So they kind of have, they've been on the team for around the same time. I know they've spent some time in Austin together. So hopefully, maybe that relationship on the floor and off the floor can blossom. So.
Did they come in with Julian? Did we get all three of them at the same time?
You're right. And I think that would mean that Mamu was on a full contract.
Maybe that's what it was.
Because we still had Dom Beasy then.
We did. We did have Dom Beasy, who took all the minutes from these guys because he was just so great.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so I had another question on this, Ethan.
Okay.
So here's the other thing about this whole Zach Charles thing, and I want to get to some comments because there's some funny ones there. Will it so if we both agree that there's going to at least be like Charles that it won't be a long leash for Zach, whenever it comes to this, even if he does end up, being the backup center. That's probably still what I would guess,
Mhm.
even though after talking about this, I would kind of prefer that, it would be Charles. But so here's if that position battle does continue. So, or do you, I guess that's the first question I had written down. Will it continue throughout the season? Or will there maybe be a potential rotation between the two in general, just depending on how they play, or even the matchup game by game? Could you see something
Mm.
like that?
I think eventually there will be a decision made on who is getting the permanent backup spot. But yeah, I think it'll be a matchup thing. Because if Zach is hitting at a more efficient clip and we don't have to worry about a big physical presence off the bench for the opposing team, I think the rest of his strengths, outweigh whatever Charles provides. But if Zach's getting bullied, if he can't get a rebound, he can't buy a shot, then that game we might play Charles. And for the first half of the season, it might just be a continuation of that battle from training camp. I could absolutely see that.
Yeah, I could too. That was something I was thinking about as well. Honestly, if I'm being completely just like, I'm going to trust the Spurs coaching staff over
Yeah,
myself.
they have a plan.
But if I'm just going with my personal opinion, I'd like to see something more concrete in the rotations. And then with both of these guys' injuries history, it's probably good to have, one or
Yep.
the other can sub in if that happens. Hopefully that doesn't. But
It's good to have both. I think that is the takeaway. It's good that we have both of these guys to battle.
and I like what John G says here. He says either way, this roster is super exciting and interesting, which I think is a great way to sum it up.
For sure.
Another thing, July 26th, SSPN OG says this season has to be make or break for Bassey and Collins. If they don't work out, it's time to move on. I do agree with that. Maybe, I might hold out a little bit hope for like a Charles Bassey potentially. But I think regardless with the nature of the roster and Wemby's ascension, I think it's make or break for both of them this year, because if they both don't improve, we already know that's the main weakness in our rotations. So I think we're going to attack that next offseason.
100% aligned. It will be addressed if neither of them take hold of that backup spot.
Okay, I gotta bring up some other comments here. So my man King Joshy J, he says Hannah says Zach Collins is having a breakthrough year this season. So there might be a crystal ball here from Hannah. That's all I'm gonna say.
Who's Hannah?
And also King Joshy J says Zach is going to hit from 37% from three next year. So we've got the prophet over here with some positivity, trying to will it into existence.
I don't know who Hannah is, but I hope she's correct.
Me too. But yeah, I mean, honestly, that was everything I had written down, Ethan. We're already 30 minutes into this thing, and we kind of flew through this, but I like Wemby's Castles question here. He says, have y'all checked out the DeMar DeRozan book?
I have not had a chance. I'm too busy reading Harry Potter.
Well, there you go on the rereading Harry Potter. Was there a new book? Am I ignorant of that?
No, I just reread this series
Good for you.
multiple times a year. Yeah.
But I think there were some comments that came out of that book. It might have just been DeMar in general as of late, talking about Pop and his impact and how they treated him like he was Tim Duncan. I believe even if that wasn't from the book, that kind of had to do with like some press around the book. So shout out to DeMar, man. We're always going to love him. And our man Dingus says King Capiche. So he disagrees with the Zach Collins crystal ball. But here's another thing that ties into our conversation. I had this thought earlier. Robert Ball says, does Zach have another year on his contract? And if so, is it a guaranteed contract? I know for a fact it would not be guaranteed because whenever we signed him, because of all the injury history, every year was a team option. But let me go to Basketball Reference or Real GM, something here, and figure that out for sure. It's either 1 or 2 years left. But I think there's a potential that this year, like the team option aside, I think this could be his last year on contract in San Antonio, if I remember correctly. Come on. Where are we?
I think he has one more.
Okay.
I don't know if it's guaranteed.
Come on. I'm on the website. This page is not helping me out. Trust, we're going to get to this. But while we're talking about or while I'm looking this up, Ethan, we did have a little bit of Spurs news. Can you believe it?
We did. Did I miss it?
Yes, but it's probably because it wasn't that important.
Was it the
Um,
court?
no, there was that. That was actually pretty cool. And speaking of that, I'm glad you brought that up because I don't know if a lot of y'all saw the city editions across the league
I did
were
see that.
leaked, and the Spurs was essentially the same. And as much as I like the hemisphere jerseys, and I didn't even hate that. Maybe I would have liked a little bit more, but I'm not totally against what they had what they have planned for this year. I was hoping for something a little different so we could do our SSPN rebrand that I've kind of been hyping up a little bit, but I think now we'll just have to stick with the hemisphere.
You know what? Let's do something. Let's do a Jude McLaren original.
We may okay. I do have some ideas there, so I
Mm,
might be able to pull that off. But I pulled up Zach's contract, so yes, we do have one more season after this year, and I'm pretty sure this isn't showing this on here on the website I'm on right now, but I'm fairly certain that every year is a team option. Um,
mm.
no, never mind. We signed him on an extension. I forgot about that. That happened late last year. Yeah. So these are actually guaranteed. So we have 2 more years of Zach Collins. He will not be a free agent until 2026.
Well, looks like we have our backup center. I don't know if he has much trade value, so we have to hope that if he's not the future backup center for the next 2 years that we want to hang on to, that he does play well this season or even next season.
Well, hey, remember Charles is on a 4-year deal as well.
I think Charles is less of a worry as far as keeping him on the roster because he can kind of settle in at that third stringer if we have to. I feel like Zach's making
Okay.
enough money to like warrant not
I see
wanting to
what you're
keep him on
saying.
the roster, you know?
Yeah. I was just kind of getting at like him for sure being the backup center,
Hmm.
but also, when you're paying him that much, you're probably going to demand more out of him too. So,
True. True that.
and that's why as kind of as much as we like Charles more, if I had to make a prediction on this, I would go with Zach.
Likewise. And just to answer the question in the comments, this is the 6th book that I flashed earlier, not the 5th one.
Callow 5 says Ethan kind of looks like Harry Potter too. Daniel Radcliffe in the crib.
Yeah, I'm actually this is what Daniel Radcliffe does in his spare time.
Kyoshi Honer, who is an SSPN OG, said it was Too Clutch C. A lot of you guys may know him from the chat. He says, "Do we have that funky cordigan?" We do not. We have it's themed like the Statement Edition jerseys that we have with like
Hmm.
a little bit of the Aztec coloring and that kind of gray and black. So I'm excited for that. I like the way that it looked.
Me too.
Um, and yeah, but the Spurs news that I was going to get to when we were getting to the contract and everything. All right, everybody light a candle, say a round of applause, say your goodbyes to Jamari Booyah.
Oh
Uh,
my gosh.
he was waived 4 days ago, which means we have an open 2-way spot. So I'm excited for that. I'm locked in. No,
You
okay.
auditioning? Are you trying out?
Yes, it's gonna be me. No, in all seriousness though, as much as this isn't a big thing, I'm curious to see what happens with that 2-way spot. But when I started thinking about this, making my notes earlier, Ethan,
Mm.
as soon as I got excited about it, I was like, oh, this is probably just gonna be Brandon Boston. And if it's not Brandon Boston, it'll probably be Malachi Flynn. So
Oh, Malachi Flynn, of course. The guy, the savior, as some people think he is.
but the fact that we signed those 2 guys to training camp deals and then all of a sudden Jamari Booyah's cut, I don't know. Maybe that won't be the case. I would actually bet more on Brandon Boston just because he's still 22.
I was also gonna ask, is Riley Minix just officially at Austin Spur? Or is he a
Um,
two-way? Oh,
I know he's on the training camp. I think he got a training camp deal, so it wouldn't surprise me if he's in Austin.
okay. Because he was also at the UT game with the rest of the team.
Ooh, okay. See,
I believe.
that's a
Yeah.
good catch. That's a good catch. I saw a couple of those photos. I didn't get to see a bunch. That if he's hanging out with the team, that could very well be that he could, end up getting a 2-way. And I would not be opposed to that with, the way that he shot in summer league. I mean, young Doug McDermott coming in.
Young Doug, young athletic Doug.
I'm not opposed to, adding a sniper to the roster who is young and, well, he's an older prospect, but y'all get what I'm saying.
Yes, I do.
July 26th puts the candles up. Wemby's Castle says, I hope you waved back. And this is the other thing. I didn't even realize this. Dingus shows us. The in-season tournament courts leaked through 2K.
Yeah, I did see that. That's crazy.
Naturally. Thanks, Ronnie. If he couldn't, he's already taking all of our money. Now he's taking the NBA's money by leaking these early.
Is what it is.
Is what it is. Okay, I know we've basically probably said as much as we can on this, but I do want to bring up this comment from Michael Hunt, who is saying he's excited for the season earlier. He says, Zach can simply shoot well on catches and be connective. I know he's not everything we want, but he has secondary skills that are really helpful. I do agree with that. We just got to see him consistently be utilized.
Agreed.
Any final thoughts on this center position before we wrap this episode up, Ethan?
Let the games begin.
Let's go. Okay. July 26th says Ethan is Harry Potter, Jude is Ron Weasley. Yes. Natalie Portman. Let's go.
Natalie Portman?
Wait, wrong actor. Oh my goodness. I just ruined myself, didn't I?
What the heck?
Sorry.
Natalie Portman.
Who plays Hermione?
Emma Watson.
Oh my goodness.
I had no idea where Natalie Portman came from.
I just don't know actresses that well. As soon as I said that, I'm like, that's not Padme. Never mind.
Yeah. Maybe that'll be the Halloween edition of SSPN. Maybe that's something that we'll do. We'll have to get a Hermione in here, though.
Oh my goodness. Yes, July 26th. I messed that one up for sure.
Natalie Portman. I was like, are you thinking of Star Wars? We're talking about Harry Potter.
I just got them mixed up.
It's all right.
But I like that comment. And you know what I like even more, Ethan?
What?
Watching Victor Wembanyama play basketball and lead this center group. I'm so excited to see year 2 of Victor. That's really my final synopsis on this episode.
Wonderful way to end it.
Alrighty, guys. We appreciate all of you guys hanging out today, all the activity in the chat. We're so excited. 2 weeks away. Really a little bit longer than that for us, but I'm just so excited. Even though it's preseason, I'm ready for the post games. So we can have something concrete to go off of and actually talk about some real ball. But with that being said, I am excited to get into our season predictions next week as well. So be on the lookout for that. Be on the lookout for clips and all the in-season content coming soon. Again, we appreciate you guys from the bottom of our hearts. Don't forget to hit that like and that subscribe button below if you enjoyed the channel. And follow us on X or Twitter, whatever you want to call it, at SSPN on YT, at Jude McLaren, and at Ethan_Quintero to stay updated with all of the content that